Good morning. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. My name is Anthony Daparan, and I'm hosting the session this morning with Joanna Chiu, speaking about her book, China Unbound, A New World Disorder. Before I introduce Joanna, just a quick plug for one of our upcoming events. This Thursday evening at 8 o'clock Hong Kong time, we have another Zoom session, Startups and Substack, How to Build Your Media Brand During the Pandemic. Will be a fantastic session, including Erin Cook, who writes the popular Southeast Asian Substack, Dari Mulut Ke Mulut, Tanmoy Goswami, the founding editor of Sanity, and Alan Soon from Splice Media. And that will be hosted by our Claire Hollingworth fellow, Jennifer Creary. So a great session coming up this Thursday evening on Zoom. But getting on to the topic of this morning's session, Joanna Chiu may be a familiar face to many of you from her time reporting in Beijing and on the ground here in Hong Kong as well. Joanna is a senior journalist for the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, and was previously bureau chief for Star Vancouver. Chiu was previously based in Beijing and in Hong Kong for 7 years as a foreign correspondent, including for AFP, one of the world's biggest news operations, specializing in coverage of Chinese politics, economy, and legal affairs. She's also served as China and Mongolia correspondent for top German news agency Deutsche Presse, and in Hong Kong she reported for the SCMP, The Economist, and the AP. As a leader and connector within the global China experts community, she's the founder and chair of the New Voices editorial collective, a fantastic collective of creative and academic women working on the subject of China, and they do some fantastic work, so that's really to be celebrated as well. Joanna's new book, China Unbound, A New World Disorder, is very appropriately titled. With this book, Joanna hasn't just written the traditional correspondence dispatch from the trenches on the ground in Beijing, but really takes a global stage and looks at China's influence really across the world. In the book, Joanna details China's rapid international rise and the ways that Western nations have contributed to a state of global disorder. She reveals how the CCP used Hong Kong here as a testing ground for its United Front foreign influence activities, and then transports readers around the world with on-the-ground reporting from frozen lakes in Russia, underground churches in Beijing, exiled Uyghur communities in Turkey, to Canada, Australia, Greece, Italy, and beyond. It's a really fantastic book in which Joanna asks, can global leaders get smarter about China, or are we headed towards greater conflict while human rights abuses continue? If you have any questions for Joanna in the course of this morning's session, you can email them to question@fccHK.org. That's question, singular, @fccHK.org. And the discussion this morning with Joanna will be moderated by our correspondent member, Rebecca Bailey from AFP. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Joanna and Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks so much for joining us, Joanna. I'm going to jump in because I've got loads of questions. Anthony's already talked about the scope of the book, so let's get started. I was listening to another interview you did, and you said you hadn't had any time off in 2 years when you were writing this.
Yeah.
Really grueling.
Yeah, I'm sure any one of us who's tried to do a big project, whether it's a really long feature story or an investigative piece on top of daily reporting, can relate to how much of a struggle it is to just manage your time to finish that big project. So yeah, it was tough, but it's nice to be done. And thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to see familiar faces in the participants. I was an FCC member when I was in Hong Kong as a reporter in like my mid-20s. So it's such a special place to me and I felt so welcome, like right from the beginning in this community. So I'm glad to see you're continuing to do these online and in-person events.
It's fantastic to have you. I mean, I guess one of the good things about the pandemic has been that we have been able to get people from all over the world to talk. You kept up your day job whilst you were writing this book, didn't you? How did you find that transition from day-to-day reporting to writing a book?
I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who might have, if you have some sort of option to take a sabbatical, even if it's partly unpaid, I think it's worth it for your sanity. I definitely burned out at some points trying to do this. Actually, for many of us, reporting is the fun part. So I got the book contract in early 2019, and then I mapped out this reporting plan that would basically where I apply my reporting skills, but addressing these global questions to do with China and its tensions with Western countries. So throughout 2019, I think I spent like 3 months on the road in total, like on my vacation time. Plus, I combined some work trips with my newspaper trips and book trips to travel to different countries to use as case studies, because I wanted to provide that immediate like foreign correspondent dispatch flavor in different countries, as well as draw on my experience, my 7 years reporting in China and Hong Kong, like on the front lines of the major protests, as well as major diplomatic events that Beijing hosted. Unlike, the average member of the public, I've seen Xi Jinping marching around, sitting around scratching his chin like countless times. So I wanted to like provide immediate, like on the ground flavor throughout the book. The marketing pitches, if you have time to read one book on China in 2021, this should be the book you should start with. I cite a lot of my talented colleagues in media and academia. So I hope it's a jumping off point, as well as like a wide exploration that people from different backgrounds can approach and almost enjoy, including someone completely new to the topics, as well as like people like yourselves who are on the ground, but might not have had the bandwidth because so much is happening in Hong Kong to also really delve into what's happening in other countries. So the case studies in Australia, Canada, US, Turkey, Italy, Greece, and also EU, China more broadly, I hope will be helpful to people like yourselves as well, who are very focused on what's happening on the ground.
And how did you pick those countries? Because, Chinese influence around the world is so widespread now. Some of them, I guess, Australia, Canada have been massive news stories this year, but how did you kind of narrow down, I guess, some of the smaller middle powers?
Yeah. So we bring up middle powers. So when we think about the major tensions between the West and China, we think about the big powers and then the middle powers like Canada or Australia, who are also seeing these increased tensions with China, where it's spilled over. It's no longer like a war of words or, diplomatic disputes. It's into the economic sphere. There's been tariffs. There's been, bans on imports of certain goods affecting Canadians and Australians. And also, unfortunately, hostage taking diplomacy. Multiple Australian citizens are in detention, including journalists. 2 journalists, Bill and his colleague from the ABC television network, had to basically flee China earlier this year. And that's really just sobering for me, like having been in Beijing until late 2018. To see this happening. So for the book I chose, it is to focus on West and China. And that's partly why I also provide a lot of historical context, because I think to understand what Beijing's doing, the great, I say, touchiness, paranoia of Chinese leaders, it's also important to understand the history of Western colonialism and imperialism in China. That's a really important backdrop. And also looking at different size countries where Canada might not feel complicit in past Western imperialism. For example, like, Canada as a country really wasn't much of a country when it was time of the Opium Wars. But even middle powers, Canada, Australia, they've had like these longstanding relationships with China for so long, and middle powers actually play an outsized role on the world stage, like Canada being a member of G7 and being a member of NATO, being so resource rich, actually has more power than you think. So I try to challenge a narrative that every Western country except for the US is in no position to even try to craft some sort of more nuanced China global authoritarianism and warrior diplomacy and things hostage taking of foreign nationals or kidnapping of people who are dual citizens, for example, being basically kidnapped from Thailand. Western countries aren't powerless. In fact, they have been every step of the way some signs. And now that all of this is playing out, many countries are still doing things that are counterproductive, like as we saw during the Trump administration, quite blatantly spreading lies, disinformation about China, making it so that in the public discourse, often Chinese people are lumped in with the Chinese state over and over again. We see like a rise in anti-Asian racism and hate crimes, where politicians like Trump are like scapegoating and deliberately kind of stoking xenophobia against Chinese people. So that makes it so difficult for people who have long been talking and writing and researching these issues to really position ourselves and speak on what are really urgent issues to do with China and human rights. And I delve into, like you said, I use Hong Kong as illustrate the wider picture of how the United Front works. Before 97, Hong Kong was a foreign territory. It was a British colony. I was born in Hong Kong and had a British passport. And so because it was foreign, the United Front methods of foreign influence were kind of in play. Methods like trying to co-opt elites of Hong Kong through things like appointments to the CPPCC, like business deals, things like that. So soft, sharp power. And then also this encouraging self-censorship in the media, using economic power to kind of encourage self-censorship. These things, I think, started in Hong Kong before it happened in Western countries, kind of a testing ground. So it's indicative of what will happen and is happening around the world. So part of writing the book is I don't kind of hide how it affects me personally. Like for me, any journalist in Hong Kong, like I know one of the two Michaels. I know Michael Kovrig. I know a lot of the journalists who had to flee China, including the BBC journalist who received death threats. Also, I grew up in the diaspora in Vancouver, where, you know, Vancouver's been such a focus of, CCP attention. Growing up, I heard adults, like my dad works at a radio station, Chinese language Canadian station, people talking about self-censorship and pressures from media bosses to, stop saying certain things, even though they were Canadians on the airwaves and Canadian soil. So I think by, making that personal political in the book and also really trying to tell the individual stories in each country, in each case study, I want to make these broad topics come alive for people. And, as journalists, we know that like human stories are engaging and illustrative of larger issues. So that's one method I use, and it informed my interviewee choices to try to make the book as engaging and accessible and thought-provoking as possible without kind of playing like the lecturer expert role of telling people what to think. I try to present these perspectives and facts and investigative material that I gathered from my research so that people can make up their minds and opinions for themselves.
Yeah, and you mentioned the United Front, and just, I'm sure most people watching this do have some idea of what it is, but could you just briefly describe it because it pops up, it's a term that pops up all through the history of the CCP, like at first it refers to, working together with the nationalists, but in its modern day manifestation and the way you talk about it in the book, could you just briefly outline what it is, please?
Yeah, I guess its roots are kind of taken from like the Leninist movements. You try to win the hearts and minds and engage allies from all over the country in different communities. Basically, I guess soft power in addition to fighting a civil war, which was what the CCP was doing against nationalists. But it only became like Mao called it, magic weapons, the United Front. And this has been kind of rejuvenated under Xi Jinping, who also called the United Front a magic weapon. So the United Front now is it's an official department, like a government department, working alongside the Ministry of State Security, so police and senior levels of government in China. And it's tasked with promoting the CCP's goals, both inside China and outside China, with non-communist, communist entities. So China also does things like they gather together socialist countries for summits and things like that. That's not United Front work because those are with fellow communist entities. It's when they're reaching out to foreign politicians in Australia, Canada, US, offering them these VIP paid trips all over China, these banquets where they're wined and dined. That's part of United Front work, but that's more like the soft part. And then the hard part is often done in collaboration with the Ministry of State Security, with secret police, where certain groups are seen as particularly influential around the world and should be more closely monitored and kind of made into allies. But what's unspoken in all of these documents that I kind of go into, like I refer to primary source materials in Chinese in the book, is that when they say that the targets of United Front work should be Chinese international students or people of the Chinese diaspora around the world, it's kind of remains unspoken if they don't agree to be allies and to support Beijing's goals, what happens next. So in my reporting around the world, particularly in Canada, because that's my backyard and that's where I hear the most stories, is that, embassy officials have brazenly showed up at people's doorsteps. In 2019, when there were these protests in Hong Kong, the anti-extradition ones, and there were like around 100 solidarity marches around the world. This was very concerning for China, as you all know. It was kind of couched as a foreign collusion. This was before the national security law. And people in Canada, Canadians in this like Metro Vancouver suburb, they were getting warnings in person to stop supporting what was happening in Hong Kong. So that's an example that's kind of unspoken in official government documents, but it's such a big part of the work. And you also pointed out that the targets seem just almost like petty. They're people who don't even identify as journalists or advocates or activists at all, including a Chinese student who's studying in a Canadian university who, for the first time, he got VPN, he was able to access Twitter. So he went on and he just was like amazed that he saw all of this discourse happening, including in the Chinese language. And so he set up an anonymous account. He attracted, a total of 2 followers in months. And he shared a few posts, including one post that was a satirical video of Xi Jinping and one post that was a commemoration post for Liu Xiaobo after he died. And just for that, Chinese police in his hometown went to his parents first, even before reaching out to the students, to kind of intimidate his parents. Like, your son is up to no good in Canada. What is he doing? You should tell him to stop. And then they called him out of the blue after that with, the same warnings, like, you'll face trouble. And he tried to deny it was him because as a law student, he knew that he had rights to do what he wanted in Canada. He also recorded the conversation and later sent it to me and showed it to police. But he's someone that kind of shows the reach and resources at the disposal of CCP for foreign influence work, because he's complete unknown, someone who's not influential. He is not a major leader of any sort of political movement at all.
He had
really just experimenting on social media. Yeah, 2 Twitter followers. And he forgot about the Twitter account. He got busy with school. He told me he wasn't active online after those test posts, just to see if he could, get away with it. But he was just amazed that he could be a target. And that's why he reached out to me and wanted to tell the story, because he just felt so violated that without really doing anything, that he was a target. So I think a lot of people don't notice, can't really grasp the reach. China's foreign interference is very granular. It's really focused on kind of like individuals who wouldn't think that they would attract this attention. Whereas, say, like the CIA, what America does, which is also foreign interference, like in many countries, like trying to topple certain regimes and replace it with what they want. That's really obvious, and it's focused on like top crust of society. Chinese foreign influence is very focused on the people. And I think that maybe arises from some of the history of revolutions in China, which were, like I lay out in the book, started kind of from the really grassroots, like Taiping Rebellion, like disgruntled school teacher who, got thousands of people together in rebellion. Maybe that history runs deep. So, ordinary people are focuses. Also, I think it reflects this kind of paternalistic view where anyone of Chinese descent, including overseas Chinese, like people like me, completely raised in Canada, are seen as kind of fair game to harass and intimidate and control because, Beijing, the CCP is kind of the motherland, including for people who don't identify at all as Chinese.
Yeah, and I guess still on the subject of these granular targets, like I was also surprised you have this amazing quote from this low level or a potential, was he even an official at the time, a community level Canadian politician who said, I'm from a rural municipality where cows outnumber people, and even I was targeted by the CCP's foreign influence operations. I guess a lot of people might wonder, I guess the argument about revolution starting from individuals, sure, I guess that makes sense about why you might go after individual international students, but why does the CCP value, I guess, trying to win over your man in rural Canada?
Yeah. I think looking at the case studies, countries where it's not the US, there are these things happening in the US as well, but I think Beijing saw countries like Canada and Australia, in some cases like UK, as really good testing grounds and areas of focus because of the large Chinese immigrant population. It feels that people who speak Chinese, who have Chinese cultural ties, are disproportionately potentially influential to people in China, Chinese nationals living or citizens of mainland China. You see that kind of really paranoid rhetoric, including again with Hong Kong, like worried that what will happen in Hong Kong will spill over to the mainland, like banning, like years ago, Instagram because of photos of the protests when Hong Kongers started using Instagram to share protest photos. Similar thinking to places outside, Greater China that like middle power countries like Canada, Australia, also to some extent across Europe, that it's worth focusing all of this attention on these people, on these, basically no names, because they are just in a state of this paranoia. And a lot of it, like as a reporter in Beijing, I can kind of see some of these sources of potential insecurity among Chinese leaders. There are actually more protests in China than you would think. Mostly there's a lot of labor protests, like factory strikes. It happens, I guess China Labor Watch, and I don't know if they're still based in Hong Kong, can operate, but they had a map of these labor strikes all over the mainland, and you'd be surprised at how many there are. And I covered things like when Chinese PLA army veterans protested as well because they wanted their pensions. And factory workers kind of feeling like they're losing their jobs to automation, to globalization, to all of these factors that could make leaders nervous because the economy year after year was slowing down, and it kind of threatens to undermine this unofficial social contract where the CCP provides prosperity and economic opportunities in exchange for people being accepting of a lower level of civil liberties. I think the instability of the Chinese economy and the structures and just rising discontent among the Chinese people that's often under the radar if you don't live in China and see it around you is also a reason why we see so many attempts to win power and influence and supporters from overseas, including like really low level officials, which you would think is not worth the time. But actually, political scientists have pointed out that municipal level politicians, mayors, they can make a lot of decisions like land use rights, like making partnerships with Chinese companies, sister city arrangements, which is, good for like public relations, education. So welcoming Confucius institutes, for example, into schools. That a lot of lower level politicians can have control over these things. So it's not necessarily a waste of time. But meanwhile, there's such like a lack of awareness of these things happening because it's seen as like a top level, you need security clearance to understand these things, to get briefed on these things kind of issue all over the world. That, politicians I've had really frank conversations with, and they expressed surprise. Like, I went to this Chinese embassy event, shook some hands, and then next thing I know, my picture was in propaganda saying that I supported, China's stance in the South China Sea or things like that. It would be deliberately twisted. Or they would give an interview to Xinhua and not realize that Xinhua is propaganda. It's not an independent Chinese outlet. Very few independent Chinese media outlets can really exist. So there's such a lack of awareness in the West. And that is an issue because it puts, I think, lives in danger. It means people are clueless when they are the ones making decisions. And people like the student Dan, who had 2 Twitter followers and got that harassment and worried about his parents, he tried to go to police to report what was happening. And police basically, he said, laughed him away, saying like, it's Canada, you're able to do this online. You can do what you want. And they did not take his report, even though Dan wanted just some sort of record so he could inform to someone like him, but they did not even take down his statement. And that's happened to so many people I've heard of, particularly in Canada, Australia.
Yeah, and there was when you're talking about Italy and Greece, like I noticed a couple of your interviewees, they sort of seem to have this conviction that they can receive lots of Chinese investment, receive lots of, I guess, tie themselves up in lots of interest with China, but will be completely immune from the kind of political influence that you've seen in other countries. You sort of think, I mean, do you think that is completely unfounded, or do you think there is a kind of way you can take the FDI and not take the political influence?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I think when you're in North America, you consume mostly like American media. It seemed like many people were hawkish or tough on China, were really aware of the political ramifications. But in basically across Europe, I hear, including to some extent the UK, like people actually, they're very new to basically thinking about China in general. I guess there's almost like a parochial, like inward looking mindset in Europe, maybe even an outdated underestimating and orientalizing of China as like weak and, not being able to outwit Europeans. And also there's a structural lack of opportunities to learn about China more holistically. In Greece, the only experts I was able to find working at think tanks, not even universities, says China studies doesn't exist in Greece. Asian studies really doesn't exist, East Asian studies. People in those like new think tanks that are working on China issues, both economic and political and trade, they had to go overseas to get their master's or graduate degrees and then go back to Greece. There's no way for them to learn about China in Greece. In Turkey, I spoke with the only owner of a Mandarin language school. And before then, there was basically no way to learn Mandarin in Turkey. So that's part of the issue. And also because China is so new and the new Silk Road investments seem so just too good to be true. In some places, like in Italy, it was really interesting. They got a lot of backlash from their allies in Europe for signing on to the Belt and Road project without negotiating with or consulting people like fellow Western leaders, just kind of doing it, striking the deal with Beijing one-on-one. But it was kind of like whipped up where certain people, like I profile like Michele Garacci, I'm sorry for butchering the Italian names, were pumping up the Italian media and public with all of these kind of promises that China would do so much to save the Italian economy. The press would run stories based on really like thinly sourced sources that China would take over all of these Italian ports. And I actually visited one of them. I went to Sicily and Palermo, where, it was rumored that Chinese investment was going to come and just, change a city and like bring so much money and just save this port that was struggling. And I spoke with the mayor, and he said he hadn't heard anything about such an investment deal in the works. It was completely just not the case, but there was so much optimism and just exaggerating of what China could do for countries, which is really good PR, soft power for China, that there's so much just enthusiasm in a pretty major Western country. In Greece, there's a bit, I think it's because it started earlier, Chinese investments, there's actually been some Chinese investments, including in the state by a Chinese state-owned company, as well as in the port of Piraeus in Athens by Costco, a Chinese state-owned shipping company. And by all accounts, even speaking with the dock workers living and working in the area, Chinese investment was quite beneficial. It did save quite a few jobs and turned around in some cases the struggling port. But then you wonder if there's any strings attached, like political ramifications. And you see in Greece in 2016 and again in 2017, it vetoed a Human Rights Council statement on criticizing China's human rights abuses. And this was the first time the EU as a bloc failed to pass such a high profile statement that was tabled and discussed at the UN. And people wondered, like, I still couldn't really get the answer, like, did Greece do it because they were just grateful for what Beijing did for its economy? Or was it a condition for helping with the port and the state electrical grid? So we don't know. But the feeling that people in Greece had, that they shared with me, was that it wasn't like a written down contract that China was like, we will give you this and you will support us at the UN and block all of these human rights criticisms. It's, Western government leaders have a say in these decisions, and that they are making them perhaps preemptively as a sign of gratitude. So that's interesting because, and I wanted to like inject a lot of nuance and context as well, and like opposing views, because I don't want to couch like deals like this as a new form of colonialism, like many people have. It's not really done through force and really coercion. It's done through a lot of people's maybe like desperation or over estimation of what Chinese money basically can do for them. And speaking with these really influential business leaders in Europe, like the largest real estate development company who was very involved in the Golden Visa investment scheme, they really look at China just in almost racist terms as, I think Chinese, they actually told me, like, I don't think much of Chinese people, but they have money, so they're welcome to come here. I don't care if you're a penguin from Antarctica. If you have money, you come to Greece. It's just a willful denial of even wanting to take into account any kind of complex, broader political, geopolitical situations, let alone I asked some of these business people, like, do you know what's happening in Xinjiang? Do you know what's happening to the Uyghurs? And they would say things like, not really, I should look into it. But it wasn't top of mind for them.
Yeah, I was struck actually again and again in like pretty much every country you cover, how it's not just a kind of evil geopolitical master plan that it's happened. You've got on one level, you've got clueless people. On the other level, you've got these just like incredibly venal business people who just want to make a buck. However, you've got local officials trying to get their own personal aims done. However, and then at the top, on top of all that, you've got a central government which may or may not have China expertise and a China strategy. So I guess, yeah, and you, I think you mentioned Montenegro as well, which is an example of an infrastructure project that they tried to get funding from many different areas, many different other institutions were rejected because it wasn't financially viable, and eventually got it from Chinese investors. But you make the point, like, can you really call that colonialism or a kind of a scheme to influence Montenegro when it's actually also just a really bad financial decision by local actors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if Montenegro ends up in debt, which it looks like it will, like heavy debt to China for this highway to nowhere, basically, that's kind of like a nationalistic project. It's hard to like blame China for imposing this on Montenegro. So like the subtitle, A New World Disorder, is talking exactly about those layers of kind of, venal, like self-interest or just ignorance or arrogance or, those layers of just like it's like the mess of all of this where you're just surprised that these major decisions would take place. In Australia, the port of Darwin was leased to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years without the central government knowing. It was embarrassing because it's a piece of Australian land that, some would say pretty strategic, like the closest point to the South China Sea. And after the deal, the Chinese state-owned company leader actually bragged that he scored this political win for China's new Silk Road project. And it all seemed really embarrassing for the national leadership because they did not even know about it, let alone put through any checks and balances. It happened without them knowing.
And now Australia has a law against that. I mean, they've moved to legislate against that kind of thing happening again.
Yeah.
In the book, you suggest that countries like Australia and Canada, I guess, are a bit further down the road than, say, some European countries, like we were just mentioning. Countries that were initially very enthusiastic about engaging with China, very enthusiastic about accepting Chinese investment. But have now cooled off quite dramatically, both in Canada and Australia's cases. I just want to, before we go any further, I just want to remind people that if you do have questions for Joanna, you can email them to question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org. But let's turn and look a bit more at Canada and Australia. Your book went to press whilst the Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were still incarcerated. They're your fellow Canadians. You're a good friend of one of them. They've been released since your book was published. I mean, first of all, are they? How are they? Are they? Are they okay? As okay as you can be? I only see Michael Kovrig's social media, and he seems remarkably be doing well considering what happened. Photos of him at the hairdresser or showing off his new physique from all the exercise in jail, where they both were basically in isolation, wasn't able to socialize and access, contact their families. Like, I couldn't imagine that. I just think I would break down within a week. So I'm just really impressed by, both of them, how they seem to have emerged pretty much intact and not, but you don't know what's happening, and they haven't spoken at length about how they're feeling and processing all of this. But I do point out that they're not the first foreigners to be taken hostage, basically, or in political situations. Several Australians are in this boat. A Bloomberg reporter, Hayes Fand, she's detained on really vague, like, national security charges. And you wonder if it's to do with the US conflict. And you wonder for the Australians, like a poet, Yang Hun-jun, and another Australian journalist she was anchor for CGTN, whether their cases are also in retaliation for Australia's much stronger stance against China. And they don't get nearly as much attention or public awareness. And I definitely think that the public attention on the two Michaels cases probably was in their favor. That helped spur, like, top leaders to make their cases a priority. Definitely in Canada, getting them out seemed like basically the top priority when it came to its China relations. So I think there's also some tough questions and soul searching we have to do here about the way we, even as journalists, cover cases of people detained. Like,
all these headlines about the two Michaels. And when's the last time someone wrote about Hayes Fan from Bloomberg, for example? So yeah, that's something I struggle with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess, it kind of feeds, I guess, Western countries, you could say, are quite, you mentioned before this idea of like the Chinese diaspora or people of Chinese descent being seen as fair game by the CCP. And like a lot of Western countries seem to sort of conveniently go along with that. Because I mean, all of the people you mentioned who are still in prison, I think, are of Asian descent, right?
Yeah, many people.
Sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I'm just gonna turn on the overhead light. It's sunset here.
In the book, you're pretty critical, I would say, of the Trudeau administration's handling of its relations with China in general. Sorry, I was saying in the book you're quite critical, it seems to me, of the Trudeau administration's handling of China in general. Do you think that the events of like the last 6 months or so, do you think there have been lessons learned, or isn't that a bit optimistic?
Yeah, I think I'm basically critical of every Western country that I use as a case study, including the US and increasingly Australia, where it's like the pendulum turns way too much to the other direction, like from one of engagement with China at all costs, like very positive, to so negative that it's cartoonish. And like I said, like President Trump, Pompeo, lumping Chinese people to Chinese state. And even today, many prominent members of the media and the political elite in the US kind of just exaggerating what China is doing and, peddling a lot of hyperbole and misinformation. It's very counterproductive. I think that the facts themselves are compelling enough to get people to care and to shape different types of foreign policy that's more nuanced, that takes into account human rights concerns when it comes to China. Like, I don't understand why there is this need to embellish and to cook up this kind of red scare, this anti-communist scare. And I think partly, including in Canada, because we see this rhetoric too, it's ideological. I think it's kind of playing into people's insecurities about Western power and dominance, which only serves to help the CCP because it's positioning itself as kind of like the leader of the underdogs of the world. People, like countries that are fed up with the US, championing all these ideals of democracy and human rights, but actually often breaking them, often committing war crimes or flouting international agreements because it can. So it only plays into what Beijing wants to do, this over-exaggeration. And at the same time, even though we don't see from Trudeau this kind of racist rhetoric, in fact, he's very, very careful to separate the Chinese people from the Chinese state. On the other end, we see just inaction and just kind of silence on a lot of issues. Trudeau and his cabinet vetoed or they abstained from voting on a measure that condemned what was happening in Xinjiang. The measure passed anonymously in the House of Commons, but none of the senior leadership in Trudeau's administration voted. So it's kind of part of a pattern where we see that in other countries too, where if you kind of, the thinking is maybe you bide your time and don't make any kind of decision or risky move of China, and then eventually these problems will blow over, that eventually China will stop this hostage taking diplomacy or it won't do it again. And I think it's a lot of wishful thinking and also probably a symptom of the fact that there's not a lot of China expertise in government. When all of this Meng Wanzhou Huawei issues were blowing up in Canada, sources told me that at a senior government meeting, an official looked around the table. People were in that room trying to address what's happening. And he said, where the F are the China people? He was looking around, looking for the China experts, and they weren't there. Realizing belatedly that the government failed to promote or cultivate these people. And like I said, in countries where there's no China studies opportunities at all, like no language learning opportunities, because language is such an important part of it. A lot of the stories we found at the newspaper that, reflected foreign interference in United Front work, it was really freely available on Chinese websites. A lot of these groups were describing what they were doing. Like, we met with this Canadian politician, and then, we said it was a New Year's activity, but then we're actually writing this post about how they support all of these things. Like, it's when you actually, like, even if you run a Google Translate, it's really easy to see what's happening. But it's as if anything written in Chinese is a secret code and it can't be broken. And it's impossible for governments to know how to deal and how to monitor what's happening on WeChat or like all of these websites. It's in Chinese, it's so hard. But yeah, that doesn't make sense. It's not a good excuse, especially in some cities in Australia and Canada and many other places. Sometimes 50% of the population is of Chinese descent. So we're not a niche population overseas.
No, and yeah, it's also, you would think if you were getting so involved with a major country like China, you would get some expertise. If we can continue talking about expertise just for a while, because actually one of the first times I kind of came across you personally was when I was working at the BBC, and someone said, "Oh, have you seen this amazing spreadsheet full of like names of women who are experts on Asia studies?" And it was just, you basically decided that there were not enough women being kind of represented in the media when it came to Asia studies, and you made this massive open source spreadsheet, which was amazing, which has now grown into your New Voices initiative. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience of like why you did that and how that went.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, and it's so nice to hear that you came across our list at the BBC, because that's exactly what we wanted that list to reach, like people who were booking guests, because you see the excuse like, "Oh, I tried to reach out to women on China, but none of them got back to me," or "I couldn't find any women experts in this subject." So it was ridiculous. I sometimes wonder, because when I was going to events, lectures or just socials, like I would actually see more women than men in general in many of these spaces. But when you look at who gets platformed on TV and at events, like sitting on panels, so many times it'd be, those all male panels, manels, which was coined at the time. So like 5 years ago, there was more like online discussions about this, like people getting fed up or people posting a screenshot of a conference where dozens of speakers and maybe there was like one woman and she was a moderator, So a group of us wanted to make this crowdsourced directory of the excuses that we kept hearing from event organizers and bookers that they tried to find a woman but couldn't. So now we have over 600 female and non-binary experts from all over the world, and we list their areas of expertise, which is basically everything to do with China, Hong Kong and Macau, their location, what languages they speak, how to contact them. So I really think that exercise alone removed a lot of those excuses, which is helpful because you kind of feel gaslit sometimes. Like, I know there's lots of experts you could have reached out to and not just these few people. But yeah, and I was really excited to see that take off. And there was so much, I think people also wanted like a more progressive and welcoming and less kind of hierarchical space to be China nerds. So we had these events all over Greater China and also in places where there's a lot of kind of think tanks and universities like DC, New York, Sydney. And like they were always really well attended and lots of men supported. Like most of our patrons right now are actually guys who really want to do what they can to support more women's voices on China being heard. We now have a twice monthly podcast that because of our donations, we're able to fund a young female journalist editor to help produce. And we have an online magazine where we have original stories as well as we just use our platforms and our social media to sing the praises of women working their books, their articles, their projects. And it's just such a rewarding initiative to be part of because there's just such a wealth of talent, and to showcase this is just really easy. We have an endless number of experts we can showcase.
Yeah, and I guess another aspect of expertise, which you've sort of touched on a little in this talk already, is the sort of the position of diaspora Asian people who are specialists, and some of the challenges they face. Like I know Vicky Xu, who you quote in the book, I've seen her kind of say on Twitter before that she's noticed whenever she's sort of quoted, it's always China skeptic or CCP skeptic in a way that's not necessarily the case when people talk to, say, someone like me who is a researcher and might be critical of the Chinese government policy. Yeah. And I also have quite a lot of friends who I guess are definitely not, supporters of the Chinese government or any government, but I guess advocate a more nuanced position, especially in the US at the moment. And have their allegiance questioned. So I guess, as someone who is yourself, a journalist of Asian descent, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, so it's really incredible that someone like me can be called like a CCP stooge and, a Chinese race traitor to the Chinese race at the same time, at the same day. After I interviewed the former Canadian ambassador to China, John McCallum, and he ended up getting fired because of what he said to me, and people felt he was like a friend of China's. I got both, race traitor and also, CCP stooge, and talking about what's happening in the US and lack of nuance. Steve Bannon made a film about me inspired by Joanna Chiu that they called Jane in the movie. Yeah, that's in the book. You can read about it. Claws of the Dragon or something, where it's very like racist and sexist, and he seems so fascinated by me because I'm a Chinese woman who seemed to have like an objective perspective on China. That is like, it's so amazing that someone who's Chinese could do something that was inadvertently negative for Beijing. So it's, and people in DC working in like the analyst intelligence world have told me that even in job interviews, they get asked, and their white peers don't get asked this, like, are you loyal to America or are you loyal to China? The head of Canada's COVID response, our top doctor, basically, she gets asked that. How do we know you're acting for Canada's best interest? Because she has her Chinese background. So that is definitely part of the New World disorder. And it's why the interviewees I chose are people who aren't I try to talk to people who are mostly women experts and people of color and people in the diaspora who receive some of these, who live in this kind of world where they have a personal stake in what's happening, and they're also experts. I find that their responses and their research is often quite nuanced and careful because of those personal risk. They can't really afford to make a big glaring mistake because they know that they'll get jumped on and criticized so much harsher than their colleagues. So I actually think their work is really refreshing and nuanced and really powerful and valuable partly because of their personal stakes involved.
Thank you. I have some questions from audience members. One from Stephen Alexander, who says, Joanna, have you been approached by the United Front for writing this book?
I don't know for writing this book, but I guess Toronto Star, my newspaper, I've written a few pieces about Xinjiang, including interviewing a Canadian couple who lived in, I think, Turpan, somewhere in Xinjiang, and provided this eyewitness testimony about what happened. They were actually living down the street from an internment camp as it was being built. So they had photos, they provided, all of these details to me and a colleague, and we wrote about it. And it seemed like for a while, probably still going on. Anytime a journalist wrote about Xinjiang, there was like, so it triggered some sort of response where I got hundreds of emails. My editors were identified. Just slander about me. People called me a ISIS member, a terrorist. And it was really interesting because the co-writer of this piece was my colleague, Jeremy Nuttall, a white guy. And he received like a fraction, tiny fraction of what I received. So it seems like when it comes to United Front work, that kind of shows that the targets that are the primary targets are still members of the Chinese diaspora, including women, particularly women journalists of Asian descent. And it's really tough because this was when I personally reported some death threats to Canadian police. And again, they're like, there's not much we can do because judges are really rarely ask social media companies or email companies to disclose IP addresses to try to identify these people, or even to know if the sources of all of this online slander and hate and death threats are coming from outside China. So I've received so much in response to articles that are critical on human rights, but it's for myself particularly, I haven't received like a official coming to my door telling me to stop doing this. But I do know journalists, including in Italy, who actually got one-on-one conversations, often from Chinese embassy affiliated officials in that country. And I've spoken with lots of Chinese Canadian journalists in Vancouver who regularly get complaints from the Chinese embassy. It seems like it's almost the role of Chinese embassy officials to kind of police and monitor Canadian Chinese language media. I suspect that I haven't gotten such obvious complaints because they see my newspaper as like a prominent Western outlet. So they wouldn't, like, I guess, dare to be as obvious about it. That seems to be the case where, especially if you're a Chinese language reporter, they kind of pull out all the stops to try to stop your work. Maybe they feel like they have more power over these outlets that are smaller and rely on Chinese overseas readers.
Yeah. And we have a question from Jessica Park as well. It's a personal one for you. Would you be able to return to Hong Kong? And if you could, would you?
I'm not sure. Like, I guess all of us don't know what the red lines are. I, like every reporter I know in Hong Kong and China, I have been reporting the facts. I provide analysis as well. And like you've seen today, I'm as critical of Western governments as the Chinese government. But unfortunately, Beijing is not rational and is particularly sensitive to when someone of Chinese descent says anything. When I was working at AFP and went to these foreign ministry briefings every day to ask questions, so it's basically the only avenue you can regularly ask questions to a member of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. After several questions where I asked about human rights cases, along with my colleagues, from France and US and all of these places, they only complained to my bureau chief about me and the other reporter who also is of Chinese descent. So it's such a focus on people who look Chinese, which is ridiculous. And yeah, I don't want to go into it too much, but it's heartbreaking because Hong Kong is my home, basically, just as much as Vancouver is. I hope things won't, continue the trajectory, but hearing reports from Hong Kongers, I'm not sure. It continues to be very vague and hard to predict.
We are running out of time. That's quite a sad note to end on. I'm sorry. But
Yeah.
I will ask you the question we ask all our guests, which is, what are you reading at the moment? And could you recommend something to our members?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you gave me a warning that you would ask this question, but I've just been so busy with the book launch. I think for people who have launched books, it's for the first time, it's so staggering how much work goes into talking about it. It's almost like if I keep going at this rate, I'll spend as much effort promoting it as writing it. So actually, I would recommend, if you're curious about how to navigate the publishing process, which I think all of you should, if you're interested in writing a book, there's a book called Before and After the Book Deal. And it provides such like practical, honest advice on the whole publishing process, like getting an agent and like how many social media posts should you do? How much should you do before everyone gets bored and annoyed at you? Like things like that. I would suggest reading that because it kind of lifts up the veil on the publishing process, which isn't very glamorous. It's a lot of work. I feel like I'm event planning and learning how to make like graphics on Instagram. So yeah, back to your first question, definitely a lot to juggle on top of a full-time newspaper job, but I think worth it because I've been loving these conversations with people that's involved in the book promo process. And for Hong Kong, this will be sent as well, but there's a book depository link that is an affiliate link for the Hong Kong Free Press, where some of the proceeds go to HKFP. You can find that on my website, joannachiu.com. And you can also see a discount code to order it directly from my UK publisher. So thanks for your support.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for that very practical book recommendation. I'm sure that will be very useful to a lot of our members.
Yeah.
Thank you for talking to us. Good luck with the rest of your book promotion. And we do hope that at some point in the future, we'll be able to welcome you here personally.
Yeah. Hope so. And if you have any questions like about your own book, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Twitter. You know where to find me. Happy to help.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good evening.
Okay. Bye. Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions and for reading and platforming.
Thank you.